Hello! Today I'm taking a look at the enigmatic antagonist of Final Fantasy VII, and a prevailing favourite nemesis within Final Fantasy for many, Sephiroth. Now, Sephiroth's an interesting character, and one I haven't really focused on before, which owes partly to the already lively discussion, theories, and debate that exists around him, which is pretty thorough and pretty interesting stuff. But also because with enduring villains like this, I think it really warrants some time and consideration to ascertain what exactly it is that makes them so appealing and succeed, as great bad guys where others don't. And as I'm playing back through the game for the first time in a couple of years, I'm really getting back into what the initial appeal was with Sephiroth in 1997, and this reputation he's built that kind of largely persists to this day. And I think this is doubly necessary, to take a step back and consider an enduring legacy character like Sephiroth, along with Cloud as a hero, and even Final Fantasy VII as a game, because they've historically been held in such high regard and have been discussed and esteemed for so long. Through the passage of time, there's naturally been some revisionist discussion around how good they actually are, which is a perfectly natural response, to overexposure and over-discussion. And I think there's certainly some who have felt this way about Final Fantasy VII, which has admittedly been assuaged somewhat, thanks to the renewed interest due to the remake. So in this episode, I'm going to discuss the characterization, story arc, and enduring legacy of Sephiroth in Final Fantasy VII, along with some ideas and theories pertaining to certain aspects of his character. Now, kicking off, and in keeping with this idea of legacy and appeal, I think it's interesting to consider Sephiroth against antagonists that have come before and since, and how we can subsequently contextualize him within this. And indeed, looking at most top 10 articles and polls around favourite Final Fantasy villains, including a recent one that I put up on the YouTube community page, we generally see opinions skewed towards some combination of Sephiroth and Kefka coming out on top, and with Final Fantasy XV's Ardyn making an increasingly prominent ranking alongside these two. And it's interesting that Sephiroth and Kefka prevail as favourites because it shows that there's no clear consistencies for what makes a great villain, as Kefka's always been this maniacal force of nature who's loud and destructive, and reminds me slightly of Heath Ledger's Joker, who is more elemental than human in nature. Additionally, by design, Kefka is intriguingly at odds with his menacing personality, as he's this brightly clad harlequin jester character. Comparatively, if we look at the emerging favourite Ardyn, we see a character who's arguably a victim, and whose very compassion and humanity cost him his life and his sanity. And equally, by design, he's appealingly vogue with his pashmina scarves, chic trench coat, and fedora hat. And then finally, we have Sephiroth, who brings yet another angle to the villain character, who's neither an arbitrary bringer of the apocalypse, nor is he an overtly flawed and human tragedy, but arguably he's something else entirely, or something in between, which I'll touch on over the course of this discussion. Looking also at his design, I think Sephiroth is an interesting departure from the ostentatious villainy we often see in Final Fantasy, and wider Japanese media, as flamboyance is traded for a utilitarian black, with the only distinguishing features being the shoulder pauldrons and the Masamune sword, which posits him firmly as a competent warrior character, which is a surprisingly uncommon antagonist type within the Final Fantasy series. And indeed, even within the setting of Final Fantasy VII, Sephiroth's design and attire distinguishes him because, despite his rank of Soldier First Class, he's unburdened by the uniform that defines his peers and comrades, such as Angeal and Zack, and later, of course, Cloud Strife. And, digressing slightly, it's amusing to note that in Crisis Core we see Genesis attempting to mimic this aesthetic distinction of Sephiroth, because he wears this red coat, and of course he desires to emulate and sort of supersede Sephiroth as the world's greatest hero, so he thinks, he deserves an equal uniqueness in appearance. Now, much like I mentioned in my Cloud Strife episode, I think this minimalist design style was excellent for both our hero and our villain Sephiroth in this game, and what contributed greatly to their iconic status was the less is more approach that helped them stand out, not only in the concept art and the FMVs, but also on the more reductive visuals of the field map screen. And both were defined by simple yet effective distinctions in colour palette, hairstyle, and weapon of choice. On this note, and just to conclude on design, it's prudent to highlight the conscious aesthetic contrasts between Cloud as hero and Sephiroth as villain, right through to their respective weapons, where Cloud handles the infamous Buster Sword, which is an abstracted and vaguely reminiscent Western-style broadsword or greatsword, and Sephiroth having a more obviously Japanese-inspired blade, similar in size and appearance to a Nodachi, which is essentially a really impractical-looking katana. And Tetsuya Nomura has stated that during the concepting phase, their team were inspired by the historic Ronin Musashi Miyamoto, and specifically Miyamoto's feud with Kojiro Sasaki, the latter of which used a Nodachi and was later killed by Miyamoto. And for anyone that might be interested in this feudal Japanese stuff and Japanese history, I'd really recommend Jonathan Clement's book, The Brief History of the Samurai, because it's a great chronology of all of these sort of samurai feuds and Ronin stories in history. And finally, moving on, we have the stark colour palettes of Cloud and Sephiroth. And for Sephiroth's part, his silver hair is excellent, I think, because its neutrality lacks the hints of personality or ethnicity or any hint of a familiar human trait that you might expect. And so, coupled with his luminous feline eyes, his design subtly hints at this otherworldliness and uniqueness about him right from the get-go. So, moving on, I mentioned in my original Final Fantasy VII review that the game was a more furtive step into the realms of sci-fi than Square had previously taken, with Final Fantasy VI forming this sort of bridge between old and new. But regarding the sci-fi leanings of Final Fantasy VII, I think Sephiroth in many ways crystallizes this evolution towards the sci-fi as a genetically enhanced super soldier and the product of experimentation with an alien life form. He is the linchpin between and the direct result of all of the distinctly sci-fi elements in the game. You know, the alien Jenova, the mad scientist Hojo, and the dystopian megacorporation Shinra. And while it's often remarked how most Final Fantasy villains reconcile at a megalomaniacal god complex and a cataclysmic end goal, their reasons for doing so and their narrative route towards the endgame are always refreshingly unique, with Sephiroth's being among the most intriguing, I think, which again adds to this enduring appeal about this character. Now, before delving into the Jenova weirdness, I'd like to touch on the narrative pacing and the gradual introduction to Sephiroth, which I think was an excellent way to establish a character who's so given to obscurity and mystery. And what we have here is a steady build-up of the idea of who Sephiroth is, through dialogue and indirect references. Starting, I think, with Cloud's childhood discussion with Tifa at the well, and I think this is the first time we hear Sephiroth's name, where he says he'd like to become strong like Sephiroth. And he later describes how only Sephiroth can wield the Masamune sword when we discover President Shinra's body in the Shinra headquarters, and so on. And in the contemporary events of the game, all of this is compounded by Sephiroth's reputation literally preceding him, by showing the bloodied corridors of the Shinra Tower, the dead president, and the mighty Midgar horrifically impaled on a tree. All of which occurs as the party is kind of pursuing, his Jenova self, the man in the black cape. And I think all of this combines and brilliantly builds him without actually showing him in person. And he remains this elusive entity who's always one step ahead, which is brilliant world building in my opinion. Moving on to our first visual glimpse of Sephiroth, beyond his character biography and concept art in the PlayStation 1 game booklet, if you played that version, we have the flashback sequence at Calm. And even here we see quite a retentive and formidable character being developed through both his hints about not having a hometown and his appearance in battle as a non-playable companion to Cloud. And we see this kind of massive disparity in how powerful he is compared to our, the player character Cloud. Now, this subtle pacing where we don't even see Sephiroth until post-Midgar looks like it's been altered in the remake for a more early introduction and a more direct interaction and antagonism with Cloud, which has been the cause of some conversation and concern. But I think, as we're on the cusp of the release date of the remake, I think any speculation on story changes and character arcs is largely redundant. And indeed, while many, including myself, have been fortunate enough to pick up the game slightly early, I don't think it's something that's particularly fair or relevant to discuss just yet. And while obviously this part of the conversation is going to age badly, I think it's a conversation for another day, and I'm going to treat the remake completely separately to this consideration of Sephiroth. But back to the pacing of the original game, my contention is simply that Sephiroth had an excellent build-up in Final Fantasy VII without even being revealed in the contemporary events until late in Disc 1. And what this allowed was, firstly, the pursuit of him seemed like a collective effort rather than just a direct feud between Cloud and Sephiroth. And so the party had a much more ensemble, collective vibe that was familiar to earlier Final Fantasy games. And secondly, as a direct result of this, it gave room for the inter-character relationships to develop. It allowed the dystopian setting and the significance of Aerith as a Cetra to be understood and explored. And it allowed the secondary antagonism of Shinra to be developed that much more. Because with Sephiroth being absent and mentioned only in passing, most of Disc 1, and specifically Midgar, was just pure world building and context for Shinra's villainy, the role of Mako in everyday lives, the Turks, the Ancients, and all of these set pieces to be established and built upon, for later in the game. Beyond this introduction to his character, Sephiroth's appearances in the game are equally well paced and come only at decisive touch points where, using Jenova as a conduit, he reveals some esoteric hints about the Promised Land and provides an occasional boss fight. The cargo ship, the Temple of the Ancients, the City of the Ancients, and so on, are the sporadic intervals in which we encounter Sephiroth prior to discovering him in stasis at the Northern Crater. And each of these encounters propels the story in a more intriguing and dramatic direction, and prove excellent narrative milestones, with Cloud's existential meltdown and the acquisition of the black materia at the temple, through to Aerith's death at the City of the Ancients, which all combine and build the villainy and the powerful nature of Sephiroth in the minds of the audience. And personally, I just think using him so sparingly yet effectively throughout the game contributed brilliantly to this mystery and enduring appeal that he subsequently maintained, because he was never once used or appeared on screen to a pointless or gratuitous excess, but just enough to propel the story, so the audience were always captivated and never tired of seeing him on screen. Now, moving on and beyond his pacing and his appearances in the game story, Sephiroth's also interesting because, despite his unsurpassable strength, he's also renowned for what we could argue is a slightly flawed and tragic story arc, owing to both his origins as a genetic experimentation, which he discovers at Nibelheim, and also his mistaken belief that he's an ancient, which pushes him over the edge into a superiority complex and an insane villainy. And I think this is interesting for a number of reasons, the first of which is that, despite all the awful things that he does, we can still on some level empathise with him, or sympathise with him, I suppose. And as suggested in my Hojo episode, there is a case for the Shinra scientist being the real villain at work here. But Sephiroth, in mistakenly believing himself to be an ancient, when in actual fact he's another thing entirely, an alien hybrid, makes him in many ways an analogue to Cloud, who likewise mistakenly believes himself to be soldier first class, when in fact he's something else entirely too. And so, as I mentioned in my Cloud episode, we have this binary between hero and villain at work, which is a recurring trope across the Final Fantasy games. And along with Cloud and Sephiroth having genetic ties through Jenova, it creates an interesting duality that thematically draws them closer together than we might initially expect. So, on the note of this tragical perspective of Sephiroth, some interesting comments I've received in the past have taken this a step further, and in fact questioned how in control he actually is when it comes to this symbiotic dynamic between himself and Jenova. And it's interesting to consider because, relating back to the antagonist Ardyn, who is overtly victimized in his origin story, if we assumed Jenova were utilizing Sephiroth rather than the other way around, it paints him as a more tragic victim character too. And I did read on a forum years ago someone suggesting Sephiroth after Nibelheim is basically dead, and I didn't really grasp this idea until I realised that this other theory exists, which is that Sephiroth is basically a puppet and an automaton for the alien Jenova. And, for example, the theory suggests that Jenova appears in a feminine form because, as we know, it's capable of shapeshifting, which is the way that it deceived and wiped out the Sentra. And with Sephiroth believing it to be his mother, it appears to him in a maternal guise in order to manipulate him. And as well, for example, the Genovia reunion theory, by its very name, it's a coming together and a reformation of the alien. And so the theory questions whether Sephiroth, much like Cloud and the other symbiotes, is equally being corralled and called to this reunion, despite his illusion of control, which I found to be quite an interesting idea that I hadn't really considered before. On the other hand, the more conventional and straightforward notion is that Sephiroth mentally overpowered Jenova and made it a vessel to perpetrate his own ends. And this holds true to and contributes very well to this idea of him and this almost godlike reputation that we have seen built up of him over the course of the game as this unsurpassable soldier, physically, mentally, spiritually, and so on. And so the very idea that he could overpower even his own genetic predecessor, or mother, as he calls it, this alien in its purest form, and commandeer its parasitic, psychic, and shape-shifting attributes for himself, it's really quite a cool and interesting idea that shows the fortitude and the resilience of Sephiroth, within the Final Fantasy VII universe. And naturally this angle would tie in neatly with his evolution in the final boss battles, where he attains this sort of status analogous to godhood, and the visual references of the seraphim angels and so on. And so Sephiroth usurping Jenova, that's a theory that works equally well in my opinion, and I think that is the prevailing canonical idea of him. So, moving on, and as I mentioned in my Cloud episode, the questionable element of Sephiroth's unsurpassable strength in the game is how he came to be defeated at Nibelheim by Cloud, whose true self, his original self, is a person that's distinguished by a certain ineptitude, or at the very least, an ineptitude that prevented him from making it in Soldier. And without wishing to go too deep into stuff that I've already discussed, the theories as to how Cloud beats Sephiroth are interesting, such as whether the Jenova cells on Sephiroth's blade gave him strength, which was a suggestion that was made in the comments, or whether Sephiroth jumped into the live stream on purpose, which the Last Order anime depicts, and so on. But one thing I will note here is the amusing theory that Cloud had preemptive strike materia equipped in the flashback sequence, which allowed him to get the jump on Sephiroth. Because having played back through that segment of the game, I can confirm that he does have preemptive strike materia equipped in the flashback. And I'll put a screenshot up of that because I just find it to be a pretty amusing and sneaky subtlety to explain events away in the original game. But regardless of the reasons, these events are essential to fostering the direct relationship between Sephiroth and Cloud, which fuels the later story arc of Final Fantasy VII, and where Sephiroth's experiences in the lifestream allowed him to attain knowledge, power, and supersede even Jenova, Cloud's Mako poisoning and delusional self equally allow him to attain this competent but ultimately false sense of self, which ushers us into the present-day events of Final Fantasy VII. And once again, it's interesting to observe these respective character arcs and the duality between them, because both begin in their flashbacks and origin stories as slightly outcasted, odd one-out characters among other people, with Sephiroth being this stoic, autonomous soldier, and Cloud being alone among the children of Nibelheim. And then they both kind of, in their own ways, go on to discover a truer self. It's just that one pursues good, and the other one pursues bad, I suppose, to simplify it to its extreme. So I'm going to wrap up on Sephiroth soon, but a final point around this duality with Cloud is how Final Fantasy VII, much like innovative sci-fi literature of the latter 20th century, and specifically the cyberpunk subgenre, which lends itself to the events of Final Fantasy VII in some respects, purposefully abstracts the conventions of the hero's journey and the conveniences of a fated destiny sort of fantasy story, and instead gives a thematic non-linearity to stories, which I think is explored through Cloud being a confused and somewhat fraudulent self in the beginning of the game, but also due to the fated animosity, at least on a spiritual level, between Aerith and Sephiroth rather than Cloud. And as I discussed in my Aerith episode, we have the dualities of light and dark and good and evil embodied by Aerith and Sephiroth, and their wielding of the white materia and the black materia, which each have opposing impacts on the world, one restoring and the other destroying. So I think this is interesting because it sort of almost usurps Cloud's status as a main character and a main hero, because so much weight is given thematically to the light and dark aspects of Aerith and Sephiroth. And where it's been mentioned that Aerith and Sephiroth were originally concepted as being siblings, which, as a recent comment to me suggested, is apparent in their similar hairstyles, I think the fact that their duality and fated animosity exists on a spiritual meta level rather than a genetic one is a much stronger theme for the game, with Aerith embodying the pure, organic nature of the planet's lifestream, and Sephiroth embodying this impure, scientific, technological experimentation, and a destroyer and a corrupter of worlds, which I think is really interesting and propels, the themes of this game forward. So, very finally, I think it's also worth noting on the music, particularly the music that accompanies Sephiroth. And Nobuo Uematsu is, of course, a huge component of the emotive appeal of the Final Fantasy games, and One Winged Angel is regarded by many as a sort of magnum opus for him, if not within the series as a whole, then at the very least for the compositions to appear in 7. But personally, I'd like to draw attention to the other accompanying theme for Sephiroth, which is the track titled Those Chosen by the Planet. And while One Winged Angel is unquestionably a work of art, I think the latter tune, Those Chosen by the Planet, is so appropriately dark and atmospheric for conveying Sephiroth, particularly during Sephiroth's descent into madness in the Nibelheim mansion. I think it deserves a shout-out for helping craft such a sense of grim foreshadowing at a time when dramatic story could only really be told or augmented by music, when all we had were these boxy field avatars to try and convey the story. So that about wraps up my initial thoughts on Sephiroth, and as I've stated here, I think he's simply an excellently developed character in his pacing and delivery as much as his iconic design, and it shows that less can definitely be more when it comes to the appearances and on-screen actions of an antagonist in a game story. I think the inevitable alterations of the remake are naturally going to steer conversation around Sephiroth and wider game events in new directions, which will be interesting to see. and I'm conscious that aspects of this episode are going to age badly, considering the imminence of this new story, which I hope in its own way proves to be, an interesting and unique game experience. To those of you who will soon be playing the remake, or perhaps already are, I hope you enjoy it. I hope we all enjoy it, for that matter. And I'm sure it's going to prompt some discussions in the future when spoilers are going to be less of a concern and I come back online. So there we have it. If you got this far, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. And feel free to drop a comment, which I will get around to answering when I'm back online. And as always, I appreciate you sharing on forums and social channels and whatnot, and also subscribing, which will keep you updated with my latest posts.